But if we remember 50 years ago, it was a time of change in the United States. The Watts riot, Lyndon Johnson was president. It was the first year that troops were sent to Vietnam. Bob Dylan turned to electric from acoustic.
That was the greatest tragedy of all.
But the but the historic significance of Madison, I think, is something that we all recognize. If we think about it, every one of us is here because of the Madison Conference. It was a time period where we were able to bring many people from different countries to attack a problem where a species population was declining quickly. It's where conservation biology was born. It was where we were able to understand how to deal with endangered species and even put species on the endangered species list. I am deeply honored to be here today with these fine gentlemen. I'm going to introduce our panelists here. We have Dan Anderson. Dan did his master's and his PhD under Joseph Hickey. He's now a professor emeritus from UC Davis. Next to him, we have Dan Berger. Dan co-founded the Cedar Grove Ornithological Station in 1950, and per the request of J.J. Hickey, he did the surveys that Hickey had done in the 30s. We have Steve Herman. Steve did his PhD in zoology from UC Davis, and he's now professor emeritus at Evergreen State College. We have Granger Hunt. Granger did his master's at Sal Ross University, and he did his PhD at University of Texas. He retired from the Santa Cruz Predatory Bird Research Group, and then he became senior scientist at the Peregrine Fund. And then, last but not least, we have Clayton White. Clayton was a former two-term director of the Peregrine Fund, and he's emeritus professor at Brigham Young University, and he's still the curator of ornithology there. All these people have been working and doing raptor work far longer than some of us in this room have been alive. I'd like to introduce Tom Cade, who was not able to make it. He had to make a Sophie's choice. He had to choose between the 100th anniversary of Cornell University or the 50th anniversary of the Peregrine Fund. He chose Cornell. However, he left us a fine video.
Ready? Greetings, raptor biologists. Welcome to this plenary session, which is about the now famous Peregrine Conference organized by Professor Joe Hickey at the University of Wisconsin in 1965. I also want to greet the panel, who are my colleagues at the conference. I'm Tom Cade, and although I cannot be with you today, I was asked to say a few introductory words on the occasion of the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the first International Peregrine Conference. Hickey's conference should be, I think, evaluated in two ways. First, by what was accomplished at the meeting, but more importantly, really, what was accomplished after the meeting as a result of the conference, which was life-changing for many of the participants. The main accomplishment of the conference itself had to do with the cause of the widespread population declines that occurred in peregrine falcon populations on two continents. Many different hypotheses were put forward for discussion, but at the conference progressed, it became increasingly clear to the biologists, at any rate, that toxic effects of the synthetic organochlorine pesticides such as DDT and dieldrin were the most likely culprits. No direct cause and effect proof could be produced at the conference, but the circumstantial evidence from Great Britain in particular was compelling and motivating, as I'm sure that the panel members will discuss. Most of the peregrine biologists left the conference determined to learn more quickly in order to rescue the peregrine from its perilous situation. Within 2 years, Derek Radcliffe, published the first proof-positive data, again from Britain, in his breakthrough discovery of the so-called eggshell syndrome. More research in this on this subject occurred quickly in North America. The formation of our own organization, the Raptor Research Foundation, in 1966, was a direct outgrowth from the Peregrine Conference, which had its initial emphasis on captive breeding. Soon there were half a dozen institutional breeding facilities in Canada and the United States producing falcons for reintroductions. As environmental activism took root in the 1970s, Joe Hickey and some of the other members of the conference participants joined forces with the fledgling Environmental Defense Fund to petition the federal government of the United States to ban the use of DDT and dieldrin nationwide, which actually happened for DDT in 1972 and a little later for dieldrin. Thus, in many respects, the Madison Peregrine Conference was a harbinger, I think, of those changes in environmental attitudes that morphed into what it came to be known as conservation biology. And all of the recovery work for the peregrine was a part of that new discipline. Now I have to turn it over to the panel members to present their own views and remembrances about the conference in 1965. I'm sure each of us remembers his own moment of decision and resolve at that conference. My own came during an after-dinner meeting and when one of the agriculture apologists was droning on for too long about why pesticides could not be the cause of the population declines. Maybe locally some effects, but not on a continent-wide basis. And in the audience was a man named Jim Rice, who was a renowned falconer and naturalist in Pennsylvania, and he couldn't take it any longer. So he stood up in the audience and shouted, "North, east, south, west, it's pesticides, 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 pesticides." And then he sat down. It was an electrifying moment because his chant reached deep into the innermost feelings of most of the people in the audience. It was a transforming moment for me. I knew then what I had to do, and for the next 35 years I did it, and until the Peregrine Falcon was eventually delisted in 1999. So have fun, guys, with your own remembrances of this great conference. It was a big deal, and all of you had important roles to play in it, and particularly in the work that followed afterward. I wish I could be with you, but no, I'm there in spirit. Have a great day. Have a great discussion.
The importance of sponsorship for events such as this, especially the Madison Conference, should not be understated. It was held at University of Wisconsin-Madison, which, as most of you know, was where John Muir went to school. It was where Aldo Leopold taught. Our next speaker is Stan Temple, and Stan Temple took the same chair that J.J. Hickey had, which was formerly Aldo Leopold's. Stan Temple was the Beer Baskin Professor of Emeritus in Conservation at University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is representing not only the University of Wisconsin-Madison, but he's also representing the Wisconsin Society for Ornithology. For this particular conference, it's important to recognize that we are supported today here by the Peregrine Fund. And so I'd like all of you to at least give a round of applause to the Peregrine Fund for those members who are from the Peregrine Fund here. So now we'll listen to Stan Temple.
Joe Hickey was my friend, mentor, colleague, and role model. It's a real privilege to be able to share a few reflections about Joe and his relationship with the University of Wisconsin and the Wisconsin Society for Ornithology, especially on this 50th anniversary of the Madison Peregrine Conference. When Joe earned his master's degree under Aldo Leopold at the University of Wisconsin, he was already recognized in the small raptor community of the day for his work on eastern peregrines. But he was even more respected among birdwatchers. His 1942 master's thesis was promptly published as an influential how-to book, a guide to birdwatching. It helped launch the modern citizen science birding movement. Upon Aldo Leopold's untimely death in 1948, Joe had to abruptly assume the faculty position once held by his famous mentor. For the next 28 years, he filled those very big shoes admirably before passing the baton to me. As a University of Wisconsin professor, Joe became both a respected wildlife scientist and an advocate for engaging the birdwatching public in serious research. Throughout his academic career, he maintained strong ties with the Wisconsin Society for Ornithology, an active organization that promotes the study and conservation of Wisconsin's birds. It was observant WSO members who sought Joe's advice on dead robins in neighborhoods where elm trees had been sprayed with DDT. That initial inquiry prompted Joe's studies of DDT and wildlife, but eventually came full circle and brought him back to concern for the status of the peregrine. When Joe wanted to document the extent of the peregrine's decline by revisiting historical eyries he had documented in his Peregrine Atlas, he didn't enlist professional biologists to do the survey. Instead, he picked two WSO members, Dan Berger and Chuck Sindlar, who had earned their stripes as raptor field workers, better known as gaboons, under the tutelage of another Leopold Masters student, Fran Hammerstrom. The survey crew found that not a single active eyrie could be confirmed. So when Joe began organizing his 1965 conference on the peregrine's global decline, it was not surprising that he sought co-sponsorship from the Wisconsin Society for Ornithology. WSO had been a steadfast supporter of Joe's controversial work on DDT, even when some in the university's powerful agricultural community had attacked him and tried their best to suppress his conclusions about DDT and wildlife. Joe stoically endured their vilification, but years later, over a pitcher of perfect Manhattans, his favorite cocktail, Joe told me with tears in his eyes how much those attacks had actually hurt. Today, of course, the University of Wisconsin-Madison proudly celebrates Joe's accomplishments, and wildlife students rightly regard him as a legendary professor, right up there with Aldo Leopold. The 1965 conference was an important event in the history of raptor research and a huge success for Joe and the University of Wisconsin. Joe knew the invited participants from around the world had given him a treasure trove of material, and he agonized for 4 years editing the proceedings and trying to make them as unassailable as possible. Reflecting Joe's confidence in their observation skills, no less than 20 of the conference participants were technically not professional researchers. They were what today we respect as skilled citizen scientists. They were, to some extent, at the vanguard of the emergent raptor research movement. The working relationship between Joe, the undaunted university professor, and motivated bird conservationists went on to produce outcomes even more significant than the Peregrine Conference. Working with concerned citizens, many of them members of the Wisconsin Society for Ornithology, Joe and his professional colleagues, along with a few political leaders like Senator Gaylord Nelson, led the charge that resulted in the pivotal Wisconsin DDT hearings and a ban on DDT, first in Wisconsin in 1970 and eventually throughout the U.S. It's fitting that 50 years after the event, we still celebrate his 1965 conference as such a milestone for raptor research and the larger environmental movement. Joe was quite a guy.
The Madison Conference was also supported by the National Institute of Health, and it was also supported by the American Museum of Natural History. We asked them for a video, but they were not able to produce one for us. We do have for us another supporter, which was the National Audubon Society. And today we have Glen Olson here to help us. He is the Glen OBrien Chair of Ornithology and Bird Conservation for National Audubon Society. Glen?
Well, thank you, and thank you, Alan and Jeep, for inviting us.
This is such an important milestone in the history of conservation, and I'm really proud that we're celebrating it and that Audubon played such a role. I'm here today because in 1965, we gave $8,000 to help fund this conference. And then nearly 10 years later, we hosted a second conference, which is not quite as academic as Joe Hickey's book, but we got Joe Hickey to edit A Peregrine Falcon Recovery, and I thought I'd just read from Roland Clement's notes, our scientist who was at the 65 conference, on his introduction. Just a little bit of background. You'll recognize some of the same names that Stan Temple and Tom Cade spoke of. This is the introduction. The genesis of this meeting is a double one. It goes back to, for one, to the first Peregrine Conference in Madison, Wisconsin in 1965. That meeting had a dual genesis. Several months before the Madison Conference, Peterson, that's Roger Torrey Peterson, and Roland Clement agreed that the eastern peregrine was in serious trouble and that Carl Buchheister, then president of Audubon, should be asked to fund a study of the bird's problems. When Clement approached Buchheister with his suggestion one workday morning, the latter fished through his papers on his desk and quietly handed a letter from Joe Hickey proposing the same thing. As a result, Audubon later supported and funded the Wisconsin Conference. In 1973, Roland Clement visited with Enderson in Colorado Springs and learned that the latter's summer studies had revealed 14 pairs of wild peregrines sitting on rotten eggs. They talked about the need to integrate a recovery program so that this could be taken care of. In October of 1973, the American Ornithologists Union met on Cape Cod. Clement staged a luncheon that included the Petersons, the Hickeys, Cade, Fife, and Marshall. Enderson was absent. And the group constituted itself a committee to organize another Peregrine Conference and persuaded Hickey to again act as chairman. A second Peregrine Conference was therefore assembled at the Audubon Center in Greenwich in Connecticut in February 1974 and enjoyed 2 full days of amicable discussion because another Audubon president, Elvis Starr, had agreed to appropriate and invest funds from the Ford Foundation to help solve the peregrine's problems. The 1965 conference was summed up in the scholarly fashion in the University of Wisconsin Press book, The Peregrine Falcon Populations Are Biology in Decline, edited by Joe Hickey, that book. This book, the 1974 conference's challenge, is a more modest one of providing guidelines that will speed the Department of Interior's development of a balanced recovery program for one of the most admirable species in nature. This program will not just be a biological feat, but will serve as a reminder to the American people that they allowed their environment to become seriously degraded, and it will hopefully serve as a model for bringing the several conservation publics together in order to accomplish something truly constructive, keeping the peregrine falcon aloft. So there was another reunion, 50th anniversary, 3 years ago in 2012, and that was the publication of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, and kind of parallel tracks, and I'm not exactly sure I have all the I came to Audubon in 1976, Roland Clement retired in 1977, but at first, it was not clear that Joe Hickey wanted Audubon's funding for the conference because we had excerpted Silent Spring in our magazine in 1962 when it was published. It was also serialized in the New Yorker magazine in 3 successive episodes. And the producers of DDT had threatened lawsuits to both Audubon and the New Yorker over that. Rachel Carson at the time was the David Attenborough or the Jacques Cousteau. She had written 3 books on the oceans, was science editor at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and did not want to write a book which she called the poison book. She liked writing about the oceans, but she felt compelled to do this. And she had won the National Book Award. When Silent Spring was published, it had over 2 million copies sold. She was on the precursor to 60 Minutes with Eric Sevareid. It was called CBS Reports for an entire hour. And Eric Sevareid said later he didn't know if she was going to make it through. She had breast cancer and died soon thereafter. But she, in many ways, helped later on. She testified along with Roland Clement in Congress in the 1960s One of her big fans of Silent Spring was President John Kennedy, who had a national commission on pesticides. And then, as it was later reported, EPA Administrator Bill Ruckelshaus in 1972 in the Nixon administration banned DDT. Audubon, we have our annual gala. We honored Rachel Carson with the Audubon Medal in 1964, and then several years later, we persuaded Joe Hickey to join our board, become chairman of our science committee, and he then received the Audubon Medal in 1974. So this is a great story. It's one that rings true with hope, and kind of one of our fundamental jobs, I think, is to keep hope alive.
Thank you, Glenn, and thank you, National Audubon Society.